Welcome to the NPTE Final Frontier podcast, helping one student at a time. Visit npteff.com to enroll today so you can pass tomorrow. Thank you for joining us here on the NPTE Final Frontier podcast. My name is David.
And my name is Emily. Today, we will be discussing how to best use your scratch paper during the examination. So first, let's dive into a little bit on how David and I both used our scratch paper. So David, you can give us a start. How did you use your scratch paper?
Of course. So scratch paper, I always find is very important to utilize to the best of your advantage. So something that I wrote on my scratch paper was motivational stuff, of course. That was my biggest thing. So I wrote at the very top of my scratch paper, I will pass. Because I wanted to remind myself that, hey, I will pass, I will pass, I will pass. I wanted to tell myself and declare myself as coming out of this with that license. I also drew a smiley face because I said, you know what? It's going to be okay. Smile. You deserve to smile. You earned the right to smile. That smile, that represents you and all of your support system being proud of you and knowing that you worked so hard to get to that moment. And no matter what, it's okay. So I drew a smiley face. Then in addition to that, I used to write out a lot during the practice exams and everything. I would just fill up my entire scratch paper with all of the different scales. But I realized that so many of these scales that I was writing on the scratch paper weren't actually appearing on the practice exams or anything. So I decided to narrow it down. I kept it to the arterial blood gases, the values, and also the Rome chart. And then the other thing that I tossed on there was the cranial nerve mnemonics. And I thought that if I was able to narrow those down, that would be great. And what I would do is I would just say, if I was able to remember whatever I studied when taking this examination, that it's still up in my brain. If I needed to regurgitate it onto this paper, I would be able to. If I needed to remember something, I would be able to. And I just believe that it wouldn't leave my brain just because I started the examination. What about you? What did you write on yours?
So I also did the motivational aspect by writing I will pass, and I also drew a smiley face. I think a big reason I did that was because I was also a Final Frontier student before I started working with Final Frontier. So I learned those tips and tricks from you guys, which is why I incorporated that. And honestly, it was amazing. It sounds like such a silly and simple little thing to do, but when you are in that crunch time, when you're in this most stressful and anxious state, it's the littlest things like that that can help you overcome that anxiousness, that stress, and help you move on to the next question and remember that everything is going to be okay. So that little tip honestly really helped me during the exam and helped me stay calm. So I encourage all of our listeners who are preparing for the exam to use a little corner of the piece of paper for motivation, whatever helps drive you, whether that's writing someone that you're taking this exam for, who you want to, dedicate your exam towards, or just writing a powerful mnemonic or a powerful motivational sentence like I will pass, something to best help you. So I did that as well. And then the other big thing I did that was different from what you did, David, was I didn't even think to write out scales and things like that because I know myself as a student, I would have felt the need to write everything and anything I could possibly think of, which was almost too much for me. So instead, as I was going through each section, I would write down any specific question I wanted to go back towards. Now, I know you can flag them during the exam, but I like to see things on paper. So I would write the question number that I wanted to go back to. When I went back to it, I would then, cross it off on my paper as like almost like a checklist or a to-do list to help me feel accomplished. And in addition to that, as I was reading through a question, my brain can run a million miles a minute. And sometimes I just need to write things out to think it through. So I would just be writing kind of chicken scratch, almost like nonsense words, but it just helped me get my thoughts together as I was reading through a question to help me be able to, sift through all of the thoughts in my brain and be able to kind of get to the right answer choice. So those are the different ways I used the scratch paper. Now, with that being said, I think our listeners can really understand now that there are so many different ways you can use the scratch paper, right? There's not a right way, there's not a wrong way. It's what works best for you. And I think one of the best ways to identify what works best for you as a listener is to practice writing these things out. So, David, you want to go into how they can practice writing it out beforehand a little bit?
Yeah, I think that practice is the key, just as you and I have spoken about on this podcast so many times. Practice exams are so important for preparation. So is practicing your scratch paper. I'm a big believer that if you're going to be writing all of these scales or whatever mnemonic you want to write on this scratch paper, know it ahead of time. Practice it ahead of time. Because if you're going into this examination and the first time that you are ever writing out a scratch paper, you could spend 5 minutes or more alone just on trying to figure out what you want to write on this scratch paper. And that energy, that time is so necessary to preserve, especially for those students who need that extra time. So much time could be cut off if you practice this ahead of time. So something that I actually did in order to assist with my practicing was I was finding that timing was an issue for me. So I would actually have a stopwatch and I would start the stopwatch and I would practice writing my entire scratch paper. I would write it all out and then I would stop the clock. And then I would look at it and then I would try to beat that the next time I rewrote it. And I would just go it over and over and over again. So this way, when it was game time, I knew exactly what to put on that piece of paper. I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to waste my time or anything like that. That was so important to me. Did
Yeah,
you
and just
actually? Yeah.
Yeah, so to go into practice even a little bit further, I think the biggest takeaway, like you've mentioned, is it was trial and error. You didn't find the perfect approach right away for you, right? You mentioned you tried writing out a bunch of different outcome measures or scales early on and just realized that was not efficient. And I think one of the most important ways to utilize scratch paper is for efficiency, for time management. And the only way to do that properly is through practice and be able to identify if you are going to write out certain outcome measures or scales. Maybe choose those select few that you notice keep popping up on the exams that you also struggle with. You don't need to write something out that you're already very efficient with and understand, but maybe if there's a certain scale or lab value that you're constantly messing up and you just want to write it out first thing when you sit for that exam to be able to kind of know that thought is already written out so you can move on and not stress about that when a question does pop up within that topic. That is how you can best use that. Now, with that being said, remember when we are writing things out that you do not want to start writing on your scratch paper until you actually start the NPTE. So, David, you want to dive into that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's really unfortunately it's at times it really is prometric dependent, but by the books, you should not be starting that scratch paper or writing anything on that scratch paper until you actually start your examination. So that doesn't mean that you are able to write on it before the tutorial or during the tutorial. You have to do it after you start the examination. If you do it beforehand, you risk the a proctor coming over and taking that scratch paper away from you. And during that time, that could cause a lot of anxiety. That can distract you. That could throw you off your entire game. Just having somebody come over to you, tap you on the shoulder, and say, "I'm sorry, I have to take this, and I'm going to give you a new one." That right there can throw a student way off the game. So when I did it, I was really protective of that. I didn't do it beforehand. I only started it after I started that actual examination.
With that being said, I think when in doubt, go the safer approach, right? There's no reason to try to start earlier. There's no reason to work up your nerves if something doesn't go right and they do take that paper away. So it's better just to wait the extra minute or two until the exam officially starts before you get the ball rolling with writing things out. Because, like you said, why add the unnecessary stress? And potential risk of anything happening to jeopardize that exam. I like to think of it as kind of like whenever I go on a plane, I never even wear my belt because I know the chance of the metal detector going off is too high of a risk to even want to be having to go through the other line in security, right?
Yeah,
Think of your scrap paper as the exact same way. Don't write anything until you know it's safe to do so. It's not worth the risk. Just take it
yeah.
on the safer side. Now, in terms of scratch paper, I know some different prometric centers give different things. So, what I was provided with as a student was I was provided with two pieces of scratch paper that were yellow in color with one pen to write it out. And they did offer that if we wanted any additional paper, that we could raise our hand and be provided with that paper. Now, what were you provided with
So that's
for yours?
interesting. So you actually had paper.
Yes.
Okay, so at my Prometric Center, I had two dry erase uh, papers and pieces of paper. And that means you can utilize, same thing with you, you can utilize the front and back of it. But once you are done with it, you weren't allowed to erase anything. You had to raise your hand and have them actually come over and bring you a new dry erase paper. And they only gave you one dry erase marker in order to write on there. So it's very interesting how every place is a little bit different.
Now I know that is, I believe what you're saying is kind of the standardized prometric tools that are provided for scratch paper. With that being said, I did also sit for my exam during the COVID pandemic, kind of when it was at the height of the pandemic. So maybe there was a different approach of what they're providing because there was more, safety precautions in place. So maybe it was more of, a sanitary purpose. I'm not really sure, but I do know a few other people who I've talked to who did also receive paper as well for theirs. But when in doubt, it's a very similar approach. What we're both discussing is similar. Just get used to practicing and be ready that sometimes there are going to be different things provided to you. You can always call your specific Prometric center ahead of time to ask what they will be providing if you just want to be as prepared as possible. And that's something that you think could add a little bit of extra stress or anxiety leading into your exam. When in doubt, just give them a call and find out what they provide.
When in doubt, go find out. It's one of those, it's definitely one of those things that you're talking about where if you feel like you're going to be stressed out over this, whether they give dry erase paper or actual pieces of paper, if they give you a pen or a dry erase marker, if you feel that you are going to stress out about this, just ask. It's okay. They're not going to penalize you for asking a question. And I think that any way that you could find yourself to have a peace of mind, that you should go do so.
So the biggest takeaways from this episode are when in doubt, ask about it, right? Be prepared. And also practice, practice, practice. Those are the best ways to make this as efficient as possible and as stress-free as possible.
For sure. Now that you have heard our recommendations on how to use your scratch paper, here's a quote from Jim Rohn. Motivation is what gets you started. Habit is what keeps you going. So, that habit is so important. We can motivate you all day, but that habit, that action of what you're doing every single day, that right there, that is the value. That is the valuable thing right there. So keep on fighting, warriors. You are powerful. You are strong. You are a Final Frontier warrior. You will pass.
Thank you very much for listening. For more information on the NPTE Final Frontier, please visit npteff.com. You can also check out all of our social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok.
Till next time, have a great day and a powerful tomorrow.